the Pope had issued a very important document called Traditionis Custodes, bearers of the tradition, last year in July, mid-July, which was a very significant document, and that was a bombshell. It really was a very surprising document that was rumored to come out, and it was really his very strong statement that the older liturgy or pre-Vatican II liturgy is not the current liturgy of the Catholic Church, and that he put very severe constraints on the older liturgy. I'll come back to that though. In recent months, however, he has made a number of statements. He was speaking to the priests of Sicily a month, 6 weeks ago, and he was in his very, very blunt fashion. He was saying, you don't want to be wearing your grandmother's lace. He was talking about, the tendency for some people to really want to be old-fashioned, and to think that that's what it means to be holy or sacred or observe mystery in the liturgy. And then a couple of weeks ago, he had a meeting with the editors of the Jesuit magazines and newspapers of Europe. He had a meeting in the Vatican, and he once again doubled down on this whole importance of the liturgical reform. So this is very much in line of where he's been going lately, and so it was a surprise and no surprise at the same time, I would say. I think there are basically three. There's a lot in the letter. It's a very, very rich letter, and I do really recommend it to people to ponder, to read, to even to meditate over a lot of it, because it's very richly spiritual. And that's the first thing I want to say is that that some of the other aspects I'll talk about will get a lot more attention, but I think that's a mistake to pass over this first point to get to those that are more, if they're more sensational or something like that. The first thing is it's a very spiritual letter. It begins with a comment of Jesus in Luke's Gospel. It is with the deepest desire that I have desired, or with heartfelt desire that I have desired, Desiderio Desideravi, to eat this meal with you. And there's a real sense throughout the beginning of the letter of his trying to capture the desire of Jesus, of the Lord Jesus, to share himself with his disciples, and in this prefiguring, if you will, through his giving of his body and blood of what he did on the cross for us. The supreme act of obedience, the Pope calls it in the document. And so there's a real spirituality of encounter, I would call it, and that's the word he uses. And he wants to really emphasize the fact that the Eucharist is an event of encounter. It's not a thing. Sacraments are not things. We sacramental liturgical theologians are very fond of saying this these days. They're not things. They are encounters. They're events. And he really wants to get at that and get at the importance of it, the spiritual importance of it, the centrality of it in the lives of Christians. So that's the first point. And I would say that's the most important point because it frames the rest of what he has to say. He appeals a lot to his favorite modern theologian. I think you could say his favorite modern theologian, a German theologian with an Italian name named Romano Guardini. The Pope actually, before he came back to Argentina, was writing a doctoral dissertation on Guardini, which he said somewhere that he intended to finish when he stepped down as Archbishop of Buenos Aires, but he got another job, so he wasn't able to finish his dissertation. In his retirement, he said, he does have a great sense of humor. But Guardini is a deeply, deeply spiritual writer, a man who wrote important book called The Spirit of the Liturgy, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So that's the first thing. It's the spiritual dimension, the dimension of encounter, of the Lord's desire to be with us, his self-giving, And our receiving, it takes two to tango, as they say. It's not only that he gives the gift, it's our willingness to receive it and encounter him. Second point I'd like to make is that, as I said at the beginning in terms of what he's been talking about lately, he really, really wants to re-emphasize what he said in that document from last July. And that is Traditionis Custodes, and that is the limiting, very severe limiting of the practice of the older or pre-Vatican II or Latin liturgy or extraordinary form. It goes by so many different names, but the Tridentine Rite, whatever you want to call it, that's the liturgy he's talking about, and he wants to limit it severely. Why? Now, this is so. Is it simply because of the liturgy? No. Now, this is a very, very important point for people to see, because very often people will say to me when I'm giving talks or classes and say, but that's such a beautiful liturgy. It's so lovely, and the Latin is beautiful, and the sense of awe and mystery are so nice, and it's so spiritually enriching. And I understand that. I grew up until I was about 15 years old. I grew up with that liturgy, and I understand it. And there was a great beauty to it. But the Pope's point, and it's a very important point, and he makes it in Traditionis Custodes, but he really wants to, and he re-emphasizes it here even better, I think, in this piece. The Council, Second Vatican Council, which is the way we live the Church now, right, for the last 60 years. The Second Vatican Council has 4 different constitutions. So it's similar to what we would call the Constitution of the United States, right? To be constitutional, right? These are constitutional of the Church. The first of these was on the liturgy, and he says that's not a mistake because it sets the path for the other ones. The other 3 are divine revelation, how we deal with the Word of God, the Church itself, the nature of the Church, especially as God's pilgrim people before anything is said about structures or authority, and then the Church in the modern world, an attempt to engage the modern world that begins with beautiful words, Gaudium et Spes, the hopes and the hopes and joy that we share with the rest of humanity. So these all form a whole. They're integral. And he says the attack, he understands, and I believe he's correct from my experience and my reading, and I believe he is correct, that the attack on the liturgy, the contemporary liturgy, that is basically an attack on the council. A lot of people don't see that. They think it's a nice ceremony that they're going to, makes them feel religiously warm, rich, nourished. I understand that. And I'm not denying that it does that for them. But there's something much bigger at stake. So that's the second thing. He says, and there's a famous phrase here, which is remarkable because it is such and you rarely find one pope contradicting another bluntly, but it's a contradiction of Pope Benedict XVI. Pope Benedict XVI has said in 2007, in the document that made it, gave wider permission to using the older rite, he had said that there are 2 forms of what's called the rule of prayer of the Roman Rite. The technical term is lex orandi of the Roman Rite. There are 2 forms of that. The older form, what he calls the extraordinary form, and the ordinary form. The Pope said last year, and he reiterates quite clearly and explicitly, literally this year, there is only one form of the lex orandi of the Roman Rite, and that is the current liturgy. Case closed, it seems to me. So that's very important. The third aspect of the document, which I think really stands out quite a bit, and all the rest is details, is the so-called art of celebration. The Latin phrase for that is the ars celebrandi. And there, one of the other aspects of what he's trying to do is, in terms of the new rite, the newer liturgy, for a lot of people, the newer liturgy gave permission to do whatever you wanted to do. So free adaptation in a way. And what he's saying is that is not what the liturgy is. That the liturgy does have a set of rules that must be obeyed. And so he's insisting on that. That the church has a liturgy, and it's the duty of those who are preparing the liturgy or leading it, people like priests, it's the duty of those people to be obedient to that, right? Because it is a common possession. A common possession. It's not the possession of an individual. And it's not primarily about individual piety, it's about a community coming together. Okay, that's on the one hand of what he says about the ars celebrandi. The other side of it is, though, that it's not something that you can do mechanically, that it is not sufficient, and the Vatican Council had said the same thing, it is not sufficient merely to obey the rules and rubrics, as we call them, the rules and regulations of the liturgy. There are plenty of them there, but it's far from sufficient to simply do them. They have to be done with the spirit of prayer and of faith, preparation, engagement, all of those things. And so the last part of the letter really does dwell on the art of celebration and on what he calls liturgical formation, right? Which is not just about the formation of people who are leaders of the liturgy, but the formation of all of us. And here he comes back, I mentioned earlier Romano Guardini. He comes back to Romano Guardini and he says, Guardini asked a very, very important question. I think this is in the early 1960s. Are modern human beings capable of the symbolic? Are they capable? Have we lost the capability to engage the symbolic? Now, I think the answer to that is no, but we haven't really developed our capacity for the symbolic. We have the symbolic in all sorts of areas of our life. Think of just politics. Think of advertising, cultural consumerism. We have lots of symbolic activity in our lives, but this religious liturgical symbolism is something we have to recapture, and that he thinks will take a good amount of work to recapture, and so this in some ways the letter begins with an appeal to this beautiful encounter with the Lord, who gives himself to us first before we respond to it. Then it proceeds to a defense, if you will, or a reiteration of the value of the contemporary liturgical reform. And then it ends with an insistence on liturgical formation and the true formation for the celebration, which is not just rules and regulations, but entering into the spirit of the liturgy itself. It's as much, and anybody who teaches liturgy and sacraments today will tell you the same thing that I'm saying. When you teach liturgy, you're also teaching theology of the church. And when you teach theology of the church, you're also teaching liturgy. The two go hand in hand. And he does, in the letter, there's a nice section which he talks about baptism as the foundation of our being members of the church, and folds that into the piece. It's a very theologically sophisticated piece, I would say. Very theologically sophisticated. The regular person in the pews, I would say the great takeaway is you should give yourself to the celebration of the liturgy and to appreciate what it is that the Lord is trying to give to you. And by the same token, you should demand, and I don't think demand is too strong a word, demand good liturgical formation, good liturgical celebration, and good liturgical formation and education.